The defense forces of Ukraine continue to conduct an offensive operation on the Melitopol and Berdiansk fronts, reinforcing their positions and carrying out counter-battery operations. Source: General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Facebook. Information is of 1800 on the 14th of August. Details: It is reported that in total, the Russians launched 12 missiles and 67 airstrikes, launched more than 40 using multiple launch rocket system attacks on the positions of our troops and settlements. Unfortunately, these Russian terrorist attacks have resulted in civilian casualties, both dead and injured. Residential buildings, a shopping center, a student dormitory, kindergartens, schools and other civil infrastructure were damaged or destroyed. The possibility of missile and air strikes across Ukraine remains high. A total of 11 combat clashes took place over the past day. The situation on the Volyn and Polishcha fronts remained unchanged. On the Severshchina and Slobozhanshchina fronts, the Russians carried out an airstrike near Stepny, Sumy Oblast. They carried out mortar and artillery attacks on more than 25 settlements. On the Kupiansk front, the Russians carried out airstrikes near Ivanivka, Zarizhov, Kharkiv Oblast, and Stelmakivka, Luhansk Oblast. The Russians carried out mortar and artillery attacks on more than 15 settlements. On the Lyman front, the Russian troops carried out airstrikes near Bilohorivka in Luhansk Oblast and Spern in Donetsk Oblast. More than 25 settlements were hit by Russian artillery fire. On the Bakhmut front, the Russians carried out airstrikes near Vashukivka and Klishivka, Donetsk Oblast. More than 25 settlements were damaged by Russian artillery fire. On the Avdiivka front, the Russians launched an airstrike near Avdiivka. The settlements of Oleksandropol, Karamik, Novokolino, Stepo, Avdiivka, Donetsk Oblast were hit by artillery fire. On the Marinka front, the Ukrainian defense forces continue to hold back the Russian troops' offensive near Marinka and Krasnohorivka, Donetsk Oblast. The Russians launched an airstrike near Krasnohorivka and Novomikhailivka, Donetsk Oblast. More than 10 settlements were hit by artillery fire. On the Shakhtarsk front, the enemy carried out airstrikes near Vlika Novosilka, Blahodatna, Makarivka, and Urozhine, Donetsk Oblast. More than 10 settlements were hit by artillery fire. On the Zaporizhia front, the Russians carried out an airstrike near Novodanilivka, Zaporizhia Oblast. More than 20 settlements were damaged by Russian artillery shelling. On the Kherson front, the Russians launched an airstrike near Olivka, Kherson Oblast. More than 20 settlements were hit by Russian artillery fire. General Staff also said that the Moscow regime continues the illegal integration of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine into its social and political space. For example, in the village of Svato, Luhansk Oblast, in order to change the leadership in local self-government bodies, the occupiers demand that representatives of administrations and village councils resign from their positions at their own will. The Russians plan to create so-called municipalities, which will be headed by local collaborators based on the results of pseudo-elections in the captured territories on the only voting day in Russia, the 10th of September. During the day, the Air Force of the Defense Forces of Ukraine struck a command post, launched 7 strikes on the areas of concentration of personnel, weapons and military equipment, and 3 strikes on Russian anti-aircraft missile systems. Ukrainian defenders also destroyed a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter. Russians conduct covert mobilization in Starobolsk, General Staff report. Russian forces have forced all men at state-owned enterprises to undergo a medical examination and register for military service in occupied Starobolsk. Source: General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Information is of 6 o'clock on the 15th of August. Quote, "The enemy continues to carry out covert mobilization in the temporarily occupied territories to replenish large-scale losses in manpower. In particular, the occupying pseudo-authorities have obliged all men at state-owned enterprises to undergo a medical examination and register for military service in the city of Starobolsk, Luhansk Oblast." Details: Russian forces launched a missile air strike on the territory of Ukraine, using 8 Kaliber missiles and 15 Shahed-136-131st Iranian attack drones in Odessa Oblast over the course of the past 24 hours. All Kaliber missiles and UAVs were destroyed due to successful combat operations by Ukrainian air defense personnel and assets. The Russians launched 14 missile and 72 air strikes, and deployed multiple launch rocket systems to attack the positions of Ukrainian troops and settlements 63 times. Unfortunately, the Russian terrorist attacks have resulted in civilian fatalities and injuries. Residential buildings, a shopping center, student accommodation, kindergartens, schools and other civil infrastructure have been destroyed and damaged. More than 15 combat clashes occurred during the past 24 hours. On the Severshchina and Slobozhenshchina fronts, Russian forces carried out airstrikes in the area of Pavlivka and Stepny, Sumy Oblast. More than 25 settlements came under Russian mortar and artillery fire. On the Kupiansk front, the Russians launched airstrikes in the areas of Ivanivka, Zarizo, Kharkiv Oblast, and Stelmakivka, Luhansk Oblast. Russian artillery and mortar attacks hit more than 15 settlements. On the Lyman front, Russian forces carried out airstrikes in the areas of Bilohorivka, Luhansk Oblast, and Spern, Donetsk Oblast. More than 25 settlements were hit by Russian artillery fire. On the Bakhmut front, the Russians carried out airstrikes in the areas of Vashukivka and Klashivka, Donetsk Oblast. More than 25 settlements were affected by Russian artillery shelling. On the Avdiivka front, Russian forces carried out an airstrike near Avdiivka. The settlements of Karamek, Avdiivka, Severn, Pervomaysk, Nevelski, Donetsk Oblast were hit by artillery fire. On the Marinka front, the Ukrainian defense forces continue to hold back the Russian troops' offensive near Marinka and Krasnohorivka, Donetsk Oblast. The Russians launched an airstrike near Krasnohorivka and Novomikhailivka, Donetsk Oblast. More than 10 settlements were hit by artillery fire. On the Shakhtarsk front, Russian forces carried out airstrikes near Vlika Novosilka, Blahodatna, Makarivka, and Urozhain, Donetsk Oblast. More than 10 settlements were hit by artillery fire. On the Zaporizhia front, the Russians carried out an airstrike near Novodanilivka, Zaporizhia Oblast. More than 20 settlements were damaged by Russian artillery shelling. On the Kherson front, the Russians launched an airstrike near Olivka, Kherson Oblast. More than 20 settlements were hit by Russian artillery fire. The defense forces of Ukraine continue to conduct an offensive operation on the Melitopol and Berdiansk fronts, consolidating their positions on ground previously gained and carrying out counter-battery operations. The Moscow regime continues the illegal integration of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine into its social and political space, the General Staff reports. In particular, the Russian occupation administration has organized the educational system based on the Russian curriculum, opening a school in Bekhteri, Kherson Oblast, where children from the settlements of Abloy, Tendrivsky, Zubarivka and Novokornomoria are obliged to study. The Russians are threatening parents with civil liability for absenteeism in order to force them to send their children to study at schools following the Russian curriculum. The Air Force of the Defense Forces of Ukraine struck a command post, launched 7 strikes on the areas where personnel, weapons and military equipment were concentrated, and 3 strikes on Russian anti-aircraft missile systems over the course of the past 24 hours. Ukrainian defenders also destroyed a Russian Ka-52 attack helicopter. Ukraine's rocket forces and artillery struck 2 clusters of Russian personnel, weapons and military equipment, 3 artillery pieces at their firing positions and 1 electronic warfare station. The General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces reported on August 15 that Russia had lost 254,920 troops in Ukraine since the beginning of its full-scale invasion on February 24 last year. This number includes 540 casualties Russian forces suffered just over the past day.